Hi again. So we're starting a new unit, which is really exciting. This is our last unit in the course, and this unit is all about intervals. So now that you know pitches, rhythms, key signatures, scales, you're ready to do this. And so if there's any of that stuff you still feel a little weak about, now's a good time to go back and review those things to make sure that you're really set. Especially with scales and key signatures, you need to be really feeling really good about those before you can really do intervals effectively, because we're going to base intervals on scales. So that's a good thing to know. But this video is just going to be a quick introduction to the topic. Excuse me. And then the rest of the videos in this unit are going to be more specific, tell you how to identify and write specific kinds of intervals, and also how to hear them. So you'll be working on that. And so I'm just going to start by doing a quick introduction to the topic. The first thing you need to know is how we define an interval. An interval is defined as the space between two notes. You can't have an interval if you only have one note. You have to have space. So you need to have two notes. If you have more than two notes, we start talking about other things. So we're just going to deal with two for right now. So we're always dealing with that space, and there are a couple of different ways that you can label that. We actually have two parts to each label for an interval. One part is a quality, and one part is a number. The number is the most basic fundamental thing that you need to know first. So I'm going to teach you about interval numbers today, and then you'll learn about interval qualities later on in the other videos for this unit. So let's go ahead and check out our staff. Here's our music staff. This is called the grand staff because it has both a treble and a bass clef together. You can tell that they're to be played by the same instrument because they have this bracket over here. So often, if piano music is usually played on the grand staff, and often the pianist will play the treble clef with his or her right hand and the bass clef with the left hand. So this is just a nice way for us to get a little bit of a visual for it. So if I'm going to decide the number of the interval, it's very important that I know how the interval is notated, because there are different ways to write different notes, right? Like we can, we can play an E flat on the piano and it's the same note as a D sharp, right? So how that is actually spelled in notation is very important to the interval itself, because it will make the number turn out differently. So let's say I have a note here on this line, E, and another note on the space above it, an F. So to determine what kind of interval number it is, I'm going to start with E and I'm going to count up. So I can either count letter names or I can count up lines and spaces. You'll get the same answer. So if I count letter names, I have E1, F2. Remember, I started with the bottom note with my counting. E1, F2. That's two notes. So I would write 2 for the number of the interval, or I would call it a second. If you want to count up by lines and spaces, you can do that too. So I would say E, the line of E is 1, and then this space is 2, and I still ended up with the same answer. So if you look at the bass clef for another example, we could say that on this space A, let's say we have a note on A here, and we have a note on E above. So if we have an interval on A, we will start counting on A and count up to E. So A1, B2, C3, D4, E5. So A to E is a fifth, and we would write the number 5 to label it. That's the basics of how to label numbers, and that's the thing you need to know first before you can get into anything else with intervals. So always count the number of the interval before you start thinking about the quality. That's going to be your first step. So you can do some practicing. You can get out some staff paper and write out a couple of different intervals. So just write 2 random notes, and then count up and see if you can determine what the interval is. Your homework is going to be a little bit more advanced than that because there are other videos for this unit, so you won't have a chance to just practice doing the numbers, but you can do it on your own. And so it's a good way to get ready for that. Okay, one other thing I want to make sure I tell you about intervals that will come in handy a little bit. Okay, so let's check out this example. on the first staff, the first line here, let's just look at that. We have 3 notes. We can determine the intervals between these notes. So I could say, let's just take the first 2 notes and look at those. Between D and G, I want to figure out what interval number I would have. So here I'd say, I'm going to count D1, E2, F3, G4. So D to G is a 4th, and I would label it with a number 4. I can do the same thing here. I could figure out the interval between G and F. Now here this interval is going down, but that's fine because we're still talking about the space between those 2 notes. So it doesn't matter what direction they're going, it only just matters how much space is between them. Direction is something else that we're not really concerned about when we're talking about intervals. So I can count down if I want, G1, F2, or I could reverse it and think up anyway. Sometimes I like doing that just because I can say the alphabet in the order I'm used to. So F1, G2, it still is spanning the same space between those 2 notes. So G to F or F to G, they're both a second, and I would label that with a 2. Now up here we can see that these notes of the intervals are not played at the same time. They are spaced out over time. So if I saw this and I was singing it, I would not, well, singing is a bad example because I can only sing one note at a time, but let's say I'm on the piano. I can only play one of these notes one after the other. The only way I play them together is if it's how we see it down here on the bottom, where the notes are lined up. So notes that are lined up on the staff are meant to be played at the same time, and notes that are separate on the staff are meant to be played one after the other. This one, you'll see this interval here. This is a second from F to G because it's 1, 2. Seconds are hard to write in notation because the line and the space kind of overlap each other, like the note on the line and the note in the space. So instead of writing these notes overlapping, we just write them side by side, kind of touching like this. So this is still meant to be played at the same time. It's just the only way you can really show it without overlapping your notes. And if you overlap your notes, it makes it really hard to read. So we're always going for clarity. So we're going to do this for seconds. But I can determine the interval the same way if the notes are being played together, just looking at the space between them. D to F is still D1, E to F3, so it's still a third, whether or not they're played together or separately. Okay, so one last thing, a couple more terms for you to remember. I said that it doesn't change the interval if the notes are played together or separately. It doesn't change the interval, but we label them, or we can call them different kinds of intervals. Actually, the label is still the same. Like I would still label a 4th with a 4 no matter what, if it was like how it was played, right? But they are called different things. So notes that are played one after the other, we call those melodic intervals because it's like written out like a melody would be written out with notes not at the same time but like in a row. And notes that are played together, we call those harmonic intervals because it's how we would play harmony. If you think about like playing a guitar, all of the notes are strummed at the same time in the chord, and that's the basis for your harmony. So notes that are one right after the other, if the interval is split like this, that's called a melodic interval, and if the interval is played at the same time, it's called a harmonic interval. So it's good that you keep those terms straight, because you might see something like write a melodic second, and then you would have to make sure that the notes were played at different times, and that's a specific way to do the interval. So I hope this was helpful. Just like I said, a quick introduction to what intervals are, and then with the next few videos you'll be learning more about qualities and how to specifically get a very specific type of interval. So I said, you know, like to E to F is a second. Any kind of E to any kind of F is always a second. So I could have E flat to F, or E flat to F flat, or E flat to F sharp, or E double flat to F double sharp, and those are all going to be seconds. Now they're different exact intervals because the space between those notes is different. If you look at all of those that I just said on a piano, the notes that you would play are different, so you're going to get a different sound, and you want to be able to specify that often in talking about music. So that's where quality comes in, and that's what you'll start learning about next. But it's good to be able to do the number before you get into that, just so it's not so confusing. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you guys soon.